When it comes to death-defying stunts, Tom Cruise is the man, and I mean literally the man. But even considering how crazy his stunts are, they can barely hold a candle to the people on this list, and I mean that, barely a candle. So without further ado, let's get to it. The top 10 death-defying stunts of all time. Number 10. LaRoche, La Mysterieuse. Leon Rausch was a 19th century Austrian acrobat and contortionist who went by the stage name LaRoche, and to say he had one of the most mystifying and arguably deadly stunts of all time would be an understatement. It was called La Mysterieuse and was based around a 30-foot high spiral track, so think a helter-skelter, but this was no normal helter-skelter, you see. It had no protective edges, which meant if you fell you would be in big trouble. And the crazy thing is, the act involved Rausch getting into a metal ball which would be about 2 feet in diameter and then ascending the track. Yep, that means he would go up, and the crazy thing is, it would seem like the ball was moving under its own volition. Even crazier, at the top, Rausch would launch his arms out of 2 holes in the ball and would wave flags to prove he was still inside, and the ball would then descend just as smoothly as it had ascended, and Rausch would emerge to much applause. Now, this may not sound that death-defying, and most people will probably assume he must have used magnets of some sort, and maybe he did, but what makes this stunt so mystifying and death-defying is not just the lack of protective barriers, it's the fact that even now people have no idea how he did it, let alone how he could have done it safely. Number 9. Monsieur Mangetout, the man who ate a Cessna 150 aircraft. You didn't mishear me, I said exactly what you think I did. Michel Lotito, who was born in 1950 and was better known as Monsieur Mangetout, which translates to Mr. Eat-All, once ate a Cessna 150 aircraft, and he did a lot more than that. In fact, he is the holder of the Guinness World Record for the strangest diet of all time, and it makes perfect sense why. You see, his public career began in 1966, and his act was eating substances that you most definitely would not think edible. Substances which should either have poisoned you or at the very least have destroyed your stomach, and yet somehow it did neither to him. This is despite the fact he ate everything from bicycles to shopping carts to televisions to glass bottles to tires to chandeliers to computers. The list goes on, and I mean literally on, and eventually finishes with, as said, a Cessna 150 aircraft, which took him 2 years to devour. And the craziest thing is, by 1997 it's estimated that he had eaten nearly 9 tons of metal. Yep, 9 tons. Number 8. Zazel, the human cannonball. I hear what you're thinking. Being a human cannonball is still common even to this day, so surely it is not that death-defying. And you're right, but you're also wrong, you see. Rosa Matilda Richter, who went by the stage name Zazel, was the very first human cannonball, and when you're the very first and you do something like this, it's crazy dangerous, especially if the year is 1877 and you're just 17 years of age. Yep, 17. That's how old Richter was when she first climbed into the spring-powered metal device known as the Great Farini, and in front of a large crowd was launched somewhere between 20 and 70 feet into the air before safely landing into a net. And just to show how dangerous this was at the time, 3 years after the first performance of her stunt, due to her getting injured numerous times performing it, the British House of Commons passed a bill designed to prevent dangerous acrobatic stunts like hers from being performed. That means it was so dangerous, the government banned her from doing it. Number 7. Frank Cannonball Richards. Frank Cannonball Richards, born 1887, is one of those people that if anybody told you about them, you would think they were talking about a fictional character. This is for 2 reasons. Firstly, it is virtually incomprehensible to think that anybody would sit around and think to themselves, I wonder if I could survive having a cannonball being shot at me from point blank range. Secondly, it is literally incomprehensible to think anybody could actually survive being shot at from point blank range with a cannonball. Yet Frank Richards not only sat around and thought it a good idea, he enacted it and survived it. That means whereas Richter's act was to be fired from a cannonball, this guy's act was getting shot at by one, and from point blank range at that. When you talk about death-defying, it's pretty hard to top that. Number 6. Lillian La France, the girl who flirts with death. Agnes Miquek, who went by the stage name Lillian La France, was not only one of the first female motorcycle stunt drivers, she was one of the most popular riders of the 1920s, and it makes perfect sense why. Her ability to ride the Wall of Death was insane. In terms of what the Wall of Death was, it was a barrel-shaped wooden cylinder where motorcyclists or drivers of miniature automobiles would travel along vertical walls and perform stunts. And the crazy thing is, what made these stunts so death-defying is the fact that the vehicles would be held in place by only friction and centrifugal force. Now, don't get me wrong, today a stunt like this would not be that death-defying due to all the safety protocols we have in place and how well we know centrifugal force. But back then, when we knew none of that and people didn't even bother to wear helmets half the time, it was crazy dangerous. And to go with this danger, Miquek had the perfect look. She wore aviator goggles, jodhpurs, and a jersey with a skull and crossbone design, which, added to her lust for danger, made her a lady who was death-defyingly cool well before being cool was even a thing. Number 5, Isaac van Amburgh, the great lion tamer. Back in the early to mid 1800s, to say that Isaac van Amburgh was extremely popular in both the US and the British Empire would be an understatement. He was a true superstar of the day, and this is despite the fact that even by the 1800 standards, his treatment of animals was especially cruel. In terms of what his act was, Van Amburgh would enter a cage in ancient Roman gear and would literally taunt his collection of lions, tigers and leopards. And just to show how far he would go with his taunts, for his grand finale, he would literally soak his arm and sometimes even his head in blood and then thrust it between a lion's gaping jaws. Yep, think about that. Covering your head in blood and then thrusting it into a lion's jaws. Crazy, I know, hence his fame and his place on this list. Number 4, Lillian Leitzel, the queen of aerial gymnasts. Lillian Leitzel was once voted the most attractive and beautiful woman in the world, yet despite this, it was not her looks that made audiences come to see her. It was her skills as an aerialist. To say the least, she was the star of the 20th century golden age of circus, and for good reason. Her act consisted of acrobatic tricks and poses which she performed without a safety net below. This is despite the fact that she would often be hanging from Roman rings suspended 50 feet above the ground. Yep, imagine that, doing acrobatics on Roman rings 50 feet above the ground without a safety net. And the thing is, it gets crazier. Yep, crazier. For her grand finale, she would grasp the ring with one hand and then flip head over heels so rapidly that her arm would dislocate and then snap back into place with each turn. I mean, think about that, with each turn, and she did a good number, and no, crazy and thoroughly death-defying, hence why she is at number 4 on this list. Number 3, Harry Houdini, the Chinese water torture cell. No list of death-defying acts would ever be complete without the legendary Harry Houdini on it, and arguably no act that Houdini ever did was more death-defying than the Chinese water torture cell. This act involved Houdini being tied upside down and then dropped into a tank of overflowing water. Once locked in, Houdini would then have minutes to escape, otherwise he would drown. But of course, he never did drown. Why? Because he was Harry Houdini, the man who could escape everything but death. Hence, why he is at number 3 on this list. Number 2, Mauricia de Thiers, the dip of death. Mauricia de Thiers was a lady stunt driver from the early 20th century who performed an extraordinarily daring act. Her act, which was called the Dip of Death, would see her drive a small car upside down before doing a reverse somersault over a 20-foot crevice at the end. And just to really show just how insane her act was, think about the type of cars they had back then. Then think about spinning upside down and doing flips in one of those cars. Then imagine doing this twice a day. Yep, exactly. The stunt was so dangerous that the Thiers told local newspapers that she fully expected to die while performing it, which sadly she eventually did. Hence her place on this list at number 2. After all, continuing to do a stunt that you know is going to lead to your inevitable death takes some steel. Number 1, drum roll please. The Great Peters, the man with the iron neck. If you want to talk about insanely death-defying acts, this one is literally impossible to top, and I mean impossible. Here's why. Have you ever sat around and thought to yourself that it would be a good idea to go bungee jumping with a noose around your neck? Well, Alois Peters, who went by the stage name The Great Peters, did just that. During the 1930s, he equally thrilled and terrified audiences with his extraordinarily dangerous yet undeniably mind-blowing hangman's act. Peters would literally climb 75 feet to a rigging suspended in the air, where he would attach a noose around his neck, which would be connected to an elasticized rope. He would then swan dive to the ground. Yep, you heard that right. He would swan dive to the ground with a noose around his neck. Now, in terms of how he survived, somehow he worked out how to maneuver his body mid-air and take the jolt out of the snap at the bottom. How he did this, nobody has any idea even to this day. And the craziest thing of all is that he successfully performed this stunt for over a decade before the inevitable happened, which occurred in 1943 when something went wrong during the act and he broke his neck. But despite this, the fact that he performed this act for over a decade makes him a worthy winner of the most death-defying act of all time. That's all from me. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, remember to get a like and subscribe to my channel, because the more who do so, the more of these short histories I can make. Is that a good bribe? I hope it is. I'll see you next time.